lunch is still here with us. This is the session where we're looking at governance. And I have to, to begin with, I thought I'm going to dazzle you with my intellectual brilliance. And after I read James's report, I decided this was a futile gesture. So I thought I'd just wear pink instead and try and dazzle you sartorially. But also, I have to congratulate James on an amazing combination of his panel, because essentially he brought together a bunch of foreigners to comment on governance in the United Kingdom, which is not a bad thing because it's. I always jokingly say it is the role of the foreigner to explain to the natives what they're all about, and I think particularly in our context we have to be occasionally reminded as to what is important to hold on to, and that's why I think that even though in your report the governance section only occupies about 4 pages, I think it is absolutely essential when you want to talk about economic success and prosperity. And you say so yourself when it says economic progress is simply not possible without the firm foundations of the rule of law. And I think this is probably one of the very significant aspects. It's the rule of law means that essentially that also the lawmakers are bound by the rule of law. It does not mean that a group of people decide what the rule is and they themselves are not bound by it. And that's something which, in a global context, is easily forgotten. I was reminded of a guy called Ivan Kaslov, a Bulgarian, who runs a think tank called Red House. He wrote an article recently where he said, until about a few years ago, even Russia and China went through the process of pretending to be democracy. They went through the process of democracy. And the fact that they're now no longer even pretend that they are, actually should be worrying us. And then you go on, it goes on in this article to talk about the culture of trust. And just going back to reminding people of the importance of things. If you go back to 1694, even I wasn't alive then, but it's worth going back to that date, which is significant because it was the foundation of the Bank of England. And that was the moment when essentially the sovereign said to the people in which we now know as a city, you have the assets, but I have the ability as an institution to create trust, to be the ultimate underwriter. And that kind of foundation of trust and ultimate underwriter is what Mervyn King calls alchemy. That's how you create money. And the ability to create money within institutions which are robust and reliable is what drives prosperity. And I would suggest to you something that as we go through at the moment, that you've got a situation that in 2008, when the global financial crisis happened, whilst the banking structures were not as resilient as they should have been, the global democratic and international institutional structure was exceptionally resilient. And if you look back and say what the British taxpayer accepted in 2008 to bail out the system and to continue making working is truly remarkable. If you had a crisis today, I would suggest to you that whilst the banks are by far more resilient, I'm not sure whether our democratic structures and the global structures are as resilient to respond to a crisis. The report then goes on and talks about legal protection, legal frameworks. Again, I would just suggest to you the creation of the concept of British trust law is exceptionally important, not just today, but also on a global context. The ability to hold assets on behalf of third parties. It's a terribly Anglo-Saxon concept, and some of the continental countries still have not really dealt with it. But then it goes on about something which I think we should think a bit more about, and that is information held by government in that report. The exchange of information is exceptionally important and a quick exchange, but in terms of our economic prosperity, and I speak here as a former politician who was on the Intelligence Security Committee, which oversees MI5, MI6 and GCHQ, I think we have to be very, very mindful of the fact that if our young people actually trust Amazon and Google with their information more than they trust the government with electronic patient records, which would deliver them a better healthcare system, then I think the democratic structure, in a sense, have to really rebalance that relationship. Because I would suggest that I'd probably rather trust the government than, because even I may not like the current government, I have the ability to change it. And have mechanisms by which I make them accountable, which we don't have over commercial institutions. The report then goes on about governmental powers, and I would urge you to give some intergenerational thought to this, because one of the significant issues of governmental powers is the power and ability to raise taxes. When I'm not at Legatum, I chair something called Change Britain, and we were set up after the referendum, and we did some research on attitudes of around the 2017 election. And it became quite clear that the under 35s in general and the under 25s very specifically actually have no faith in the ability of governments to deliver anything. Quite frankly, they think governments are rubbish. The only institution they've got any faith in is NHS, and the reason why many of them want to nationalise the rail industry is not because that they are left-wing Corbyn's children who think nationalisation is a good thing. It's because they're saying, well, turning to my generation, you guys privatised it, it's not delivering a decent service, and cost the earth massive. Nationalised it can't be any worse. The reason why this is important is because if they don't believe in the state and the ability to raise taxes, and their willingness to pay for taxes will be severely limited. And as part of another work which we do at Legatum is work on devolving powers within the UK and to more local institutions. It is my contention that we probably are looking at something that the citizens want a much closer relationship between tax-raising powers and discernible benefits for it. And if we don't establish that, then the big role of government, which is as a rule maker, a rule supervisor, an infrastructure provider, will be severely undermined. But so far, so good. The report is very complimentary about the administrative accountability, and I think they're right to do so. I think administrative law, the ability to have judicial review, and openness as to decision-making processes is something which I think the UK can be proud of. With it, an independent civil service, as to whether the civil service is quite as independent these days, or whether it's a question of that its capacity to deliver has been undermined, I think is another question. But we're speaking on the day when the acting cabinet secretary is publishing a letter in the Times telling politicians not to openly criticise civil service. As a little aside, when I was young, there was a deal between the civil service and the public which said, you're an independent civil service, you receive index-linked public sector pensions, and for that you are not expected to, within 6 months of retiring, going on the public media criticising the government. But things are changing. However, what is not changing, and again the report, I think, with great clarity, it outlines, is judicial quality. One of the things which I think contributes significantly to economic prosperity is that not only that you know what the law is, but you also have some faith in the stability of the law remaining to be so, and that the interpretation is in a way which is, broadly speaking, predictable. It's not a random or very disruptive process. So the report does mention that our judicial system is at times more expensive. I would just, for those to wear my foreigner's hat, say that, of course, it's in the British system where you don't become, as a law student, say, and I'm going to become a judge. The judicial career path in the UK is different, and you become a judge much later in life than you do on many of the continental jurisdictions, the comparisons. I remember a few years ago, it was quite surprising why in Germany the sentences for drug use were going down. They were looking at the sentencing pattern. And they were saying, why is this happening? Legislation hasn't changed. But what had changed is the age of the judges. And they had a completely different attitude to LSD and marijuana. And so therefore, I think the structure of the British judiciary in that sense is inherently different. And then it goes on to government efficiency. And it said something very important here. It says, many a political policy debate centers on inputs. And implicit within this argument is that if inputs are increased, output will somehow commensurate increase. And I think this is one of the things which you really have to look very closely at. That it is not necessarily that with extra government spending do come better public services. For example, in '99, when the Blair government put in incredibly increase in money on the NHS, there was a deal with the NHS itself that it had to reform, it had to change its delivery. And the two, when they go in hand, are very important. What I wanted to finish off with is two things. One was I wanted to quote Mervyn King to you. Mervyn King in his book on alchemy, it's just a few sentences, but essentially alchemy for him is the ability to create money, and for that you require sovereign. And he says we're going through a period at the moment where we are running up against extraordinary tensions between the demands of international trade, the demands of democratic accountability, and the demands of the sovereign. And I think we're seeing those tensions currently playing themselves out in front of our eyes. Because not much later, Mervyn King went on the Today programme and said, you have to ask yourself how the world's sixth largest economy with a reputation for political stability and administrative capacity has got itself into such a mess as it is at the moment. To which I would say to you, change is always difficult. Change is rarely a carefully planned process. And what you need when you have to respond to change, which is what I think we're doing, is actually systems which are adaptable and are resilient. And I do think that we have the processes in place which provide for their accountability, they allow for resilience, but above all, they allow for an ability to change. And the very final thing, as we're such an international panel here, I thought I finished with a quote of Ludwig Erhard, the father of the German economic miracle, or the social market economist. And he said in an exchange to Hayek, he said, I hope you don't misunderstand me when I speak of a social market economy. I mean that the markets as such are social, not that they need to be made social. And for that, to allow the markets to challenge monopolies, to challenge vested interest, to allow for continuous change, it is then the important thing for governments and our institutions to provide that accountable framework. And therefore, those 4 pages in this report are a necessary condition for continued economic success. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have 3 other speakers, and we start with Stephen Brien from Legatum.
Great. I'll take a seating here. So, Gisela, thank you very much. I would like to first of all agree with you that I think there's a lot to praise in terms of British governance. I think it's easy, as you say, for those of us coming from different countries to be able to reflect on that and play back to this audience our perspectives. In many ways, I would say that British governance is probably one of this nation's greatest exports. And if you look at how, I think the report says 27% of all international contracts are subject to British law, not to mention the other 20% that's subject to American law, which effectively is a derivative of British common law. And when you look at countries like Singapore, or you look at countries like United Arab Emirates, and particularly the Dubai International Financial Centre, very explicitly adopting British commercial codes. There is something to be enormously proud of in that, and I think it's sort of recognised in the report, and Gisela, I think you've summed up many of its good aspects. But I'd like to touch on three themes that I think we perhaps have not drawn out that explicitly. I think implicitly, yes, but I'd like to sort of put labels on them just to start a discussion. One is around the sort of soft versus hard aspects of governance. The hard aspects could be the rules, the formal relationships. The soft are the norms, the expectations, how people behave within these institutions. And I think in the end of the day, in a sort of a modern world, those soft aspects, back to your social aspects of markets, are more important than the formal rules. And many of the examples you gave, such as China, may well have had the formal rules that looked a bit like a sort of more market-oriented quasi-democracy, but everybody knew underneath it the norms and behaviors were not there. And I'm going to pick up on Graham, I think, he just left. But there were actually three things that he said in his earlier remarks that, when you string them together, I think are quite interesting. Early in his comments, he said institutions shape performance. So what he was saying was, don't just look at the GDP and the productivity numbers, think about the institutions that are supporting that, governance being a big part of that. Another comment, he said, civil societies create institutions. So we're stepping back another layer, that the institutions themselves are a product of civil society. And then later in his talk, he said, ideas and narratives inform society's values. I'm paraphrasing slightly, but he was talking about the creative destruction, redemption narrative. And I think unless we get those social narratives right, unless we get the civil institutions right, our civil society right, we won't get governance right. And this is one area where I think you can see in the way that, say, President Trump is behaving, is that at times he is stepping outside the norms of behavior in international institutions. He's not yet, as it were, necessarily broken formal rules, but for example, his justification for the trade tariffs were an interesting interpretation of national security. It wasn't formally wrong, but in an informal norm-sensing way, he changed the norms. And that shows where I think the informal aspects of these institutions in governance are as important as the formal ones, I think often underplayed. Then the next theme I'd like to I think we need to push on, and particularly again in the report, James, look at you, James, on this one, is to pick up on Hernando's earlier comments. Again, I'm going to make it explicit. For whom is this governance? Because you laid out really, really very evocatively that the property rights system in Peru was a form of governance tailored to the international markets, not a form of governance tailored to the citizens and the needs of citizens. So I think, again, as we look at structures of governance, cui bono, who benefits, and are we actually designing a system that benefits, and this is the inner Marxist in me now, are we designing a system that benefits international markets, or are we designing a system that benefits the populations? They don't necessarily have to be in conflict with each other, but I think too often governments are looking to that FDI, looking to the international investment, and saying to themselves, what rules do I need to put in place to attract the Tatas of this world to come in, without recognizing the cost on the community of some of those rules or the exceptions to the norms that are permitted for the more powerful. And then the third element that I think we need to focus on and think about as we discuss governance is what is it for? And this will pick up on the theme before lunch around entrepreneurialism. And Gisela, you touched on it too. Is our system of governance there to protect property rights of those who have property? Back to what James was saying about the continental system where value creation was very difficult and the emphasis was on sort of preserving capital, preserving what you had, rather than the emphasis on building something new. And if the system of governance establishes formal property rights, establishes a rule of law, but all those are geared towards stasis, if they're all geared towards protecting and preserving as opposed to growing and building or changing, we've got an issue. So for example, I think two ones come to mind. In the middle of the 19th century, the creation of the limited company, an enormous change in corporate governance that allowed and permitted change and allowed and permitted risk-taking. And likewise, say in America, Chapter 11 bankruptcy, again, is a form of governance that enables and facilitates change. And I think we've got to ask ourselves, in a world of openness, in a world of change, does the system of governance protect what we have, or does it allow us to build anew? And I think that, you touched on the word change. I think it's really important that governance is set up to permit orderly change. So I go back, soft versus hard, who is it for, and does it permit change, or does it protect what we have? And I think if we can work on those three, we'll start to develop a good theory of governance to underpin this index. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now, Allie Renison, Head of Europe and Trade Policy, IOD.
Thank you. I wanted to pick up on some of the remarks. Is this on? I can project my voice, I'm an American. No problem there. I think one of the remarks that you were making that followed the earlier ones from this morning about, in terms of property rights, that sort of dichotomy between, not that it's necessarily mutually exclusive, actions being taken that impact the citizens and international markets being the sort of guiding priority, because I think that is one of the biggest dichotomies that we're currently facing in terms of how we make this potentially massively momentous change in terms of how governance and regulation is structured. I don't want to spend my whole time on the B word, but I just think it's impossible to leave alone, in the sense that I was speaking to a friend of mine who lives in Singapore, and he said, it's made me think, and he is a sort of member of the liberal metropolitan elite that we are all probably members of, that, and this is probably a reaction to the changes that are happening in America and potentially in the UK from his perspective, that maybe it would be better off if we didn't have such a thriving politics, basically, in effect, because you would have governments making decisions that were sort of basically had economic priorities at their absolute apex. And you see that also, and I think when you see this discussion about what kind of trading nation does the UK want to be, and there's all this discussion about Singapore and the Singaporean model, so to speak, which I think is actually much misunderstood in terms of what their corporation tax rate is and isn't, and how much of the state occupies the sort of centrally planned economy. Leaving that aside, when you look at it from the perspective of how we are going to deal with governance issues going forward, I think, even though I think Gisela's right to say that the structures in place are very adaptable and flexible, I think that they are under severe strain at the moment, and I'm obviously speaking about this from the perspective of a business organization that engages with government and tries to understand how the thinking is going on in terms of the decisions that are being made for the future, and I think this comes back to that accountability and efficiency point of view. Because you can have the structures in place, protection of intellectual property and property rights generally speaking, that the UK is so well known for. You can have the fact that English law is sort of governs such a significant degree of contracts worldwide. But in terms of how we think about governing going forward and what kind of jurisdiction we're willing to accept from a foreign institution, that being the EU in this sense, I think it starts to emerge that there are some crises coming ahead of us. And there's different ways in thinking about this. I think we're not at the stage yet in the US that I see in my home country where trust in institutions has been significantly eroded in a very short amount of time for different reasons. There are part of the population who thinks effectively, similar to what President Trump has, that institutions like the FBI, like the CIA, the previous sort of White House administrations have degraded those offices and become sort of rank with sort of instinctive bias towards a certain political liberal elite. Then you have people who think effectively that what the current administration has done has eroded trust in those institutions and has made them laughingstock, so to speak. I think as we navigate the way forward, we're going to start to see some of those tensions really emerge, and I pick out one of those in respect of trade policy that I think is very interesting. Because I think that there is this tension between wanting to be seen to be making Brexit a massive success, but sometimes I think it comes at the risk of not having a significant enough or being seen to have a conversation with the population about what its priorities are. Some of that is inevitable. It's a reflection of the fact that we are currently in a negotiating stage that is unlike any other, where decisions have to be made very, very quickly. Some of it is a reflection of some, quite frankly, bungled handling of negotiations that I can see, and I give one example where we were asked to do some mapping of data collection that could have informed government prioritization around customs union very, very late in the day. And when I asked why this had been done so late in the day, I was told that, you know, civil servants hadn't been given the clearance to ask for this kind of information, at which point my jaw dropped, because this to me was a basic element of contingency planning, so to speak, to have this kind of information gathered. And there does seem to be this fear gripping, whether it's the civil service or politicians, about making any kind of decision that sort of gives away what we're trying to do in these negotiations. And it's going to become a big issue in respect of our future trade policy, because when I look at comparative examples, the US, Canada, where they have had ample sort of amounts of time to, I would say, almost leisurely develop their trade policy, how they regulate commerce. So that, and I remember we had Stephen Harper, the former Prime Minister of Canada, over a few weeks ago, and he was saying that it was really interesting. It struck me. He said, at every point, we always knew during our trade negotiations how every different stakeholder group was going to react, because we'd had that engagement process with them. And I think at the moment the government is sort of careening between wanting to be seen to be doing things that take advantage of the opportunities of us leaving the EU without knowing how we can sufficiently do that, because we're in this kind of vortex of negotiations that nothing seems clear at the moment. And I think it's going to become, you know, I think if we look at Jeremy Corbyn's front bench and the people who are advising him on trade policy, I think, and I seem to remember at one point he said that he wanted to take a leaf out of Donald Trump's book, or it was reported that he had said that. And to me, the first place you go is on trade policy, because it's very easy to sit there and say, effectively, if the UK government is running into a trade negotiation with, for example, the United States, without having been seen to engage different stakeholders in terms of the overarching strategic framework of priorities that they actually want, what sectors do you want to prioritize, what markets do you want, what is it you want out of a trade policy, then you potentially kill it before it's even gotten going. And I think there will always be people who sort of, you know, are in this position of criticizing government institutions. There will always be the quote-unquote the antis, so to speak. But the government, in my opinion, has not done a sufficient job at all of trying to explain what its overall long-term thinking is. And I think part of that is because the negotiations are forcing it to be very sort of short-term and reactive, and sort of holding all of their cards and their priorities close to their chest. But my fear is going forward that public trust in government institutions, and I would extend that to, everyone thinks that it's just a question for the citizens to think about, even from a business organization perspective, there is a feeling of being left out and locked out of what the government is thinking at the moment. And I won't even get into the devolved administrations, but at the moment, unfortunately, we are in a situation where I personally think that the union is potentially more at risk simply because we are in this vacuum kind of situation where the government cannot take powers that are eventually going to come back to the devolved administrations and give them to them effectively, because you couldn't pause the negotiations, have a discussion about what kind of framework for chemicals nationally or agricultural support you want to do, and then go and talk to the EU. It has to effectively do the negotiations first and then have that conversation. So it's the wrong way around, but for inevitable reasons. So just to sum up, I mean, to me, I think that the UK has a huge amount of strengths in the governance area to draw on, to sort of see its way through. My fear is that every policy decision it takes, particularly in terms of commerce, is being seen through the prism of the referendum, and therefore those dividing lines are being really ensconced and made much more concrete and hard to sort of take over. So I think that the government has a massive task ahead of it throughout these negotiations, which will probably keep going for the next 4 or 5 years, to try and be seeing not only in context of the negotiations themselves, but in terms of the kind of Britain that it wants to build, what global Britain actually means, to take people with them.
Oh, that was all very interesting, and just going back to Gisela's going through the report, I just want to say that it's very welcome that we have this, of course, but the problems with the UK are, of course, manifold, but one main one is that we don't have a written constitution. So talking about transparency, things evolve on precedent, if you like, and then case law, which actually leaves quite a lot of insecurity in terms of anyone dealing with this country, even though overall, obviously, the rule of law is pretty good and people feel quite comfortable with it. But actually it evolves rather than being able to just go and say this is exactly how it should be, because that's not the way it works. The second thing is that Allie actually touched on it, is that we have a very centralized system. We are moving towards more devolved administration. We already have that, of course, in individual countries in the UK. But there is still a huge amount of centralization going on, and therefore the more centralized it is, the more difficult it is to see what the actual policies are and penetrate the system and have the access that you need to be able to really understand it. So that's another problem that the UK has, which some of the other countries that James has compared us with don't necessarily have. Not that they don't have different problems, but it's just very difficult, therefore, to just do standard comparisons across, because the experience one has is quite different in different countries. But I think, again, what Gisela said is absolutely essential. Actually, this is the most important bit of the report, because if you don't get this right, then none of the other things can really work. But it is, I think, it's useful to just think of the links that exist between proper government and the state and business. And we've got it split in this report in terms of enterprise and other areas. But if you just look at the FTSE 100 and you think of what the role of the government is in those firms, which of course, and that is reflected all across the economy. In reality, many of them are directly regulated by the state, whether it's by the Competition Authority or the Bank of England, for example. Many of them procure to the state, in the sense that we buy lots of pharmaceutical products from the various firms that produce those medicines and so on. The people involved in defence, they have almost an oligopoly in terms of the way in which they sell to us. So everything that the government does has a direct impact on those firms, and everything that they do, thank you, also has a direct impact on the state finances, for example. And we see this, for example, right now with the big arguments about the price of medicines and what the NHS is being charged. So that and the very close links, therefore, that exist create a bit of a problem. It happens in other countries too, but we tend to underestimate, because we think that the state is in one place and it's a different party that really wants to nationalize. But in reality, whether a firm is nationalized or not, it still comes very much under the influence of the government, and their fortunes are absolutely and directly linked to it. And when I joined the government, I was actually quite surprised, working for the DTI at the time, to find quite a lot of firms represented in the business department. It makes a lot of sense, of course. We want their expertise. But actually what was going on, to a considerable extent, was industry capture happening. So you have a whole automotive sector, and then you had the energy bit, which was all part of DTI at the time. And of course, these people there were influenced to a considerable extent, and I'm not saying in any malicious way, but because they were there doing the analysis, what was happening in relation to help to those sectors. To the point that I had to reorganize the entire department on the economic side, because evidence was often ignored. And that evidence, which should be showing that, for example, you don't need to spend all that money on the automotive sector. It actually manages perfectly well in the market, and there is no additionality that you can prove to this. Of course, there are regulations on emissions and other stuff that we know one gets into trouble with. But overall, a number of things that perhaps the government was doing were not absolutely necessary, because the businesses would have done that anyway, and also it created a bit of a sort of competitiveness issue, because you tended to be in favor of one side rather than another, or maybe one domestic firm rather than another, or a big multinational that wanted to come and invest and therefore influence quite significantly what you were doing, because they were so important. So although overall we come out quite well, and I agree with James's report, we have to bear in mind that actually there is a lot that has been going on that maybe has led us to being in a position where we're not as competitive as we should generally be, and where there are some big firms that have dominated various sectors that shouldn't have been the case here. And maybe, since there is also a whole area here about public accountability, have you spent the money properly, that it is quite right that should be looked at really, really carefully. And one of the areas where we lack is in evaluation. We generally don't want to spend any money on evaluating anything, so we don't.
We should do an awful lot more of that. And again, certainly the civil servants have been pushing very hard for this, and as is the Treasury, frankly, too, because the last thing it wants to do is waste any money and generally would like to sort of cut it. And yet we have this sort of culture that doesn't accept that they've made a mistake. There isn't enough flexibility, certainly not among the politicians. It's quite a lot of pilots haven't really quite done it. I mean, look at the universal credit issue right now. And yet we tend to say, well, that's fine, we're just going to roll it over and it'll all be fine in the end, which of course it isn't. And we still waste huge amounts of money. And of course with it, we cause quite a lot of hardship at times, and the lack of trust in the system that we have now follows from it. And what is also a problem, I think Gisela touched on the issue of the independence of the civil service. I mean, imagine being an economist. I was joint head of the government economic service for a number of years, 1,500 economists, including those at the Bank of England, and being constantly attacked as a useless expert. Who wants to listen to the experts? Or having David Davis say, well, those impact assessments, I'm not sure they exist, and even if they did, I don't really believe in economic models. What does that do to the incentive, if you like, of the civil service to do the right thing? And to, in a way, not necessarily hold ministers to account, but show that some of the things that perhaps they are suggesting, and I'm talking now completely irrespective of the political leanings of a government, because I worked quite a lot for the Labour myself at the time that I was there, how you really can't get them to, what you should do as a civil servant is accept that's what they want to do, but show the difference that might exist in different permutations of a particular policy, and do proper cost-benefit analysis that actually gets perhaps to the least bad outcome, or in many cases the best outcome. And what you find is that certainly when something goes wrong, the politicians very rarely take the blame. They blame the civil servant or the person who runs the agency, like the students' fee one, for example, and others. And again, you cannot, as a result, have the type of civil service that is really prepared to be as open as possible and feels that it's being supported by its own politicians. And I say again, this happens under any government, not just whether it's Conservative or Labour or the coalition, was actually pretty similar. And then the final point I'll make on this is really what Allie also hinted at, which is the transparency issue. What is going on right now is that businesses, which are supposed to be the backbone of the economy, cannot really get enough access to understand what is going on. So the way in which the Brexit negotiations have taken place has, I think, left quite a bitter taste to businesses which have had loads and loads of meetings but actually find that they're not getting listened to, or at least they have the same meeting again, time and time again, given quite a lot of reassuring noises but ignored. And if they dare say anything of concern, they get attacked by the press, by other politicians. I'm not going to repeat what Boris Johnson said about business, of course, which cannot be said again. But there is seriously, right now, a lack of transparency which cannot be conducive to investment staying up. And we've seen exactly what is going on in this area. And as Gisela was saying again, we are all foreigners up here, and I'm Greek, which some of you already know, and others will have already guessed from my accent. And of course, Greece has gone through a terrible, terrible time. Being in the euro. I was never in favor of the euro, I have to say, even though I'm in favor of Europe generally. How can I not be, despite what the Germans did to us, Gisela?
I won't take it personally.
But I can now say without blushing that right this minute, Greece is better governed than the UK is. And that's a sad thing to have to say. Thank you.
Well, I thought on that exceptionally provocative note, I was wondering whether Hernando Pessoa, would you like to respond to some of these discussions? Or?
Just something Stephen said, which was important because to me, because I had an interview before and somebody was asking, why hasn't capitalism really caught on, or capitalism in the form of liberal democracy and markets caught on, brought in something that Stephen was saying, which is how important to a market economy is also the governance of private enterprise. And you mentioned limited liability. Yeah. And of course, that's extremely important, because if you don't have limited liability, you can go into business with full liability, which is like going to a poker game and putting all your chips at once. So considering that in every developing country we've gone, from Egypt down to Peru to Mongolia, the amount of companies that have limited liability are 2%. The amount of companies that actually that have perpetual succession, in other words, automatically there's a mechanism whereby you actually have created a different person. It's a legal person that lives on forever, provided it can fund itself. That's also 2%. In other words, when you do a deal with somebody in a third world former Soviet Union country, considering all the enterprise existing, you better bring a doctor to check out how their health goes, to see if they're going to be alive much longer, to be able to commit. So one of the things, and that of course relates, of course, also to the idea of property rights. It's intimately connected, because obviously property right allows you to manage your enterprises with limited liability, with perpetual succession, with the right to issue shares. Again, only 2% companies have the right to issue shares. That is to pledge something against an investment. If you don't have that, you can't grow. And the whole idea behind a market economy or an international market is scale. Dixit from Adam Smith to Karl Marx. It's scale that allows you to do all sorts of things. So I just wanted to bring in what you had brought in, madam, of the idea of trust, right? Trust many times isn't only, a question of culture. We people sort of here have always trusted each other. This is the way we are. It's also, I trust you because you got limited liability and I know how much you can pay. I trust you because I know who's going to succeed you. There's a lot of things that have little to do with your culture, but just simply the fact that you can enforce the law and you don't have it in other countries. That is the important. And another little item there in terms of governance, if you get it right, things work. I've just been now in Switzerland, and somebody was explaining to me at that time, I think I've said it before, so it was explained to me at that time, have you ever seen a country with 4 groups of Europeans that really don't like each other? You've got the Swiss Germans that think the French are ballet dancers. You've got the ballet dancers who don't really trust Italians because they're too smooth, and all of them don't trust the Fourth Republic of Switzerland, which are the Gypsies, the Romansh. But yet it all works because there is a legal system in place, and it's Roman law, so it doesn't have to necessarily come through your tradition of judge-made law, which requires having good judges and formed over time. So I just wanted to simply say that that what you're talking about, governments and institutions, is crucial, as if you've said. The Chinese also know it. When I was in China, I was confirmed that they have 160,000 rebellions a year, especially in the interior part, 160,000. It's more than 100 people each time with violence involved. So bringing it all in isn't also an easy task for the Chinese. We just don't know much about it because, like in Latin America or everywhere else, in the third world, the coastal cities are what is best known. Well, that's simply because you asked me, and I've got jet lag, and I'm a Latin American, and I like to talk. Thank you.
Can I ask a question about local democracy? Currently in the UK, there's a great fashion to have fiscal devolution, to devolve power to metropolitan mayors to address this whole issue of trust, etc. But clearly that's got lots of problems. I'd just like to get your thoughts as to whether that's the right way we should be going, or is it going to hit problems in the future?
What do you have? If you take some
I think it takes a go. Remembering, of course, that Gerard was Boris Johnson's economic advisor for a number of years, so he has quite a bit of experience with the local government challenges.
And he's written a very fine book, which the rest of the book is almost as good as the foreword, which I read. Actually, I mean, before Gerard, the work on the effective government program, which we're doing with regards to is very much looking at that, and that's why I kind of also talked about the ability to raise taxation. Because I think we've seen devolution as being where we devolved responsibilities for not the financial means to actually have more local decision-making powers.
Yeah.
And that's why I think the question of the willingness to pay tax and an ability to see delivery, I think will take us down to greater localization, whether the politicians like it or not.
To pick up on Hernando's point, I think from our research so far, Switzerland is actually a really good example of this. Best known for having referenda all the time, but let's pass on that for a minute and look at the power of the cantons and the power of the municipalities, far greater here than here. And I think the other piece of this that's quite different, to pick up on your point, Vicky, there's a settlement document in Switzerland that establishes the power of the relative parties, the people, the cantons, the federation, that sets it all out. And we see it in other countries that have good governance. For example, Norway, or even recently in the last 15 years, Japan. Each of them has a more explicit settlement document. So I take issue with you about Britain not having a written constitution. It doesn't have a codified constitution. I think it's all there in documents, but it's not codified. And at one level, there's no single place to go that says these are the powers that the federation has, these are the powers the local authority has, and effectively these are the powers the people have. Switzerland does that really well, and it balances that with, when Gisela was hinting at it, with a fiscal balancing effort that would make the Barnett formula seem rather simple and naive, and actually has a good sense of which cantons generate wealth, which cantons have structurally poor situations, and how do you get that balance right. So they've made that settlement, both fiscal settlement and power settlement, much more explicit. And I think that's the challenge here. Is a common law culture one where you can codify such a settlement in the first place and move away from a lineage of judge-made decisions to one where, at one level, we the people stamp out a settlement to move on from?
You're quite right. I mean, the other thing that complicates it here, of course, is that different mayors have different powers. So it's very, very confusing for anyone. Of course, everyone is trying to get more powers and to say, what about London? Even London doesn't think they have enough powers, and they're absolutely right, and so on. So that's not the way we're going about it isn't particularly good. But of course, we are making some moves in terms of keeping more with the localities, if you like, in relation to commercial rates, for example. So those are now being kept. So there is a bit more of the ability to keep that money and do something with it. But that's about it for the moment. But I think it needs to be rethought considerably more.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to me when, and I'm going to come at this again from a trade and a trade policy perspective, when we ask people who are trading with the US, what is their biggest issue? Tariffs never comes up. I'll tell you what does come up is the differing local sales taxes, for example, the different liability insurances from a regulatory perspective between the states. And so I think that's quite actually, I think that's going to be a big challenge to government going forward, is particularly in respect of future trade agreements, in terms of trying to put this narrative of we want to be, and again, I think it brings again that sort of dichotomy between, is it just about sort of attractiveness as an investment location, or is it about what you're able to do for your citizens, and are they mutually exclusive? I think it brings that to the fore again. Agricultural support's another one. That there is an expectancy that in a few years' time we will be able to devolve agricultural support, potentially procurement policy, for example. You have different procurement policies between the U.S. states, which are an absolute nightmare when you are doing a trade negotiation. That is not the end-all, be-all of how you need to think about it. But I do think that some of this discussion about devolution does put into contention how far the UK can really go in its trading ambitions, at least in respect of trade agreements, because the more that you devolve, the more complicated future trade policy becomes.
But just to add on that sort of taxation, before coming here, I just was checking where taxes were coming from. And it's only 9% of the tax take last year came from business rates and property taxes, which we could have a local level. But combined with national insurance income tax, it's 43%. So I think a closer link of that individual taxation to the locality, I think, is a way forward. James.
Other questions?
Auctioneer.
Well, Fernando?
I can try to do it.
Sure.
Sorry. Thank you very much. No, I just thought, as I heard United States, how you control power, and what you were saying about, do you need an encrypted constitution or not? One of my professors, which indicates how time has passed, was the right-hand man of Erhard, was Wilhelm Röcke, who wrote up, right, who wrote up the idea of liberal social democracy. And he was once talking, you just remind of that because it was very well put when what you talked about was the response between Hayek and Erhard, but he put out the following thing: it doesn't really matter what the system is, it's what's important is to follow the principles of l'esprit des lois, the spirit of laws, of Montesquieu, which were all about how you divide power, right? The judiciary power, the legislative power, and there's different ways of doing it. And he quoted Montesquieu, who 300 years ago was asked how he got to this brilliant, simple idea that the important thing is that you divided power. So what is it that you saw? Asked his cousin in a letter to Montesquieu. Was it that your father did the execution, your mother did the legislation, the mother-in-law decided who was right? Where did it all come from, the seed? And if I may just quote in French, because it's very nice, I just remembered it as you said it. He said, oh no, not at all. It hasn't to do with that. It has to do with how I have observed politicians and what happens when somebody becomes of an important person in the politics of any country, their psychology changes. So he says, so the importance of division of power or any system of government is, let me say it in French quickly and then in English, c'est pour faire rappeler au souverain que n'importe à quelle hauteur il est assis, il est toujours assis sur son cul. It is to remind the politicians that no matter how high they sit, they're always sitting on their asses. Yeah. So it doesn't really matter, you codify, you don't do it. The important thing is keep everybody under control or you're going to come out like us Latin Americans.
Which of course I was very much thinking of that when, I can't remember who was talking about, Vicky, when you talked about the civil service. Of course, that is where the collective memory, the longer time span could come from. And some government advisor was saying to me that, the Lib Dems in 2010, the politically shrewd thing by the Lib Dems would have been to do what coalition government in the continent do, and take one or two portfolios, and you only deal with those. So when you go to the next election, you can say, look, this is what we did. The Lib Dems took one minister in virtually every department. So in 2015, all they could say was saying, you have no idea what the Tories would have done without us, which the lecturers doesn't buy. However, some civil servants were saying to me, it was extraordinary that those 5 years internally, the ministers had to bicker with each other. So by the time you had the ministerial interchange with the civil service, it was actually much more focused. And it was the minute after 2015, the ministers were going, oh, well, at long last we've got rid of those Lib Dems, and the battle lines changed. And in terms of the good governance, you have to make sure that in which arena you have the fights and where you have the consensus seeking, and that does change.
So coalitions are good for good governance?
No. Well,
potentially.
You already have coalitions within the big political parties.
Broad church.
And actually, I think one of it's worth remembering one thing. We do not have right-wing racist parties being able to establish themselves and then our electoral system actually gain places in the House of Commons to hold any parties to ransom. So when it comes to the UK immigration policy, we will not have the AFD as the official opposition.
So you're against proportional representation then? Because you would.
That's more of a function of the voting system rather than any ability for it to emerge. So in the United States, it is emerging within the two-party system, effectively. And I can't help but wonder if that's more a reflection of the voting system, keeping them out, rather than it being able to... I'd be very interested to see what happens if there is this absolute outrage over whatever we come back with the EU, I don't think there would be a split in the Conservative Party, but whether it would lead to that kind of emergence. Does Nigel Farage come back and lead that? I'm not so sure that we can discount it. I just think that's more of a function of the voting system.
Which we decided to keep as a result of a referendum. Nobody seemed to question, I think, if I remember rightly.
Just one question. Was it a referendum or was it a plebiscite?
Oh, and is it referendums or referendums?
No, a plebiscite is when you only have one choice, the status quo and that. A referendum is like in Switzerland, you have 4 or 5 choices and then you narrow it down.
Right, there were plebiscites.
There were plebiscites. There were plebiscites.
Plebiscites.
It was a plebiscite.
Yes.
But there's a very good report which the Constitution University of London published on independent review into the conduct of referendums, where Dominic Grief, who is now completely, different, and I were part of the members, and we all agreed on certain principles on how you do conduct referendums. And one of the major recommendations was that you should never ever call a referendum, because you can't deal with internal party political split in any other way.
Yes.
Yeah.
Did you also agree that you shouldn't continue to have referendum until you get the answer that you desired to begin with?
Well, no, we put it slightly differently, which says that it is perfectly possible, and sometimes you could say desirable, to have a referendum which is in various stages, like New Zealand on the electoral system. So they had a first referendum which said, should we change the system? And after that, they said, and now we have a second referendum which says, which one should it be? But we said that if you have 2 stages of a referendum, you must say so at the outset.
Yeah.
What you can't do is start off by saying you have once in a generation chance, and then say, but we've now defined generation as 2 years.
Right, we have time for one final question before tea.
Life expectancy has gone down.
A final question before tea, anyone?
Can I add something just really quickly? Sure. And just as a parting thought, it's a very, I don't know how niche of an area of property rights it is, but one of the things I'm always interested by is how there hasn't been a real big discussion in the UK about where intellectual property, I'm saying this because I spoke at an IP conference in Boston last week, but it was fascinating to me. There was a huge discussion about which way Europe is going, quote unquote, closer to the citizen and away from, there was this big vote against copyright directive. And that was something that was seen as being anti-innovation, but something which the industry here massively pushed for. And so to me, it's always been this interesting contradiction within the center-right circles, because libertarians would say that IP is corporate rent-seeking in effect, different gradients of it, whereas for the mainstream center-right, it's an important aspect of property rights. So I just want to leave people with that thought, because I think it will start to emerge, particularly what happened with the US agreement is effectively the US is being seen to be forcing its IP laws onto other countries, and whether that's going to emerge in our own trade policy going forward. So I thought I would leave that out there.
Can I echo that? And actually, triggered by some of the earlier conversations, I was trying to Google over lunch a book that I read a few years ago, which I felt got not enough traction, which is around congestion of property rights, both in terms of networks, IP, etc., where you can actually have too much of a good thing. And this comes back to the change versus stasis. If you end up giving too many property rights, you are protecting asset holders, preventing change, with the famous Disney clause that has basically allowed Disney to perpetually receive rent from Mickey Mouse's image way beyond normal. And I think we do have to be careful. Again, who's benefiting from this? What degree of property right protection do you need to encourage innovation and to protect people's rights in that space, versus giving effectively a long-term rent for somebody or their heirs, for that matter?
Well, in last minute, I'll just tell you, the most futile exercise I ever indulged in was in the early 80s. It was the most enjoyable trip I ever had in my life. And I was going to China. This was 1980. I was trying to persuade the Chinese to join the international copyright laws. It was great. I was going to all sorts of places in China no Western woman had ever been. I got absolutely nowhere with this concept of writing up whether it was 50 years or 70 years. And in terms of the trade negotiations with China, this is still one of the real problems. It's not even just protection and stifling innovation. It's respecting some of them.
But it's interesting when you look at the law and how it's applied in China. You have more cases coming to courts on intellectual property theft than you do anywhere else. So within China, they take it quite seriously.
So there was some progress.
Good job. Must have been all you're doing.
Exactly.
Ladies and gentlemen, I would like you to thank our panel very much for an absolutely stimulating conversation.